guys, so today I'm going to show you how to make a 1-part and a 2-part jig for your bent lamination. So this is my 1-part that I made. It's really jacked up. Don't do this. Don't do what I do what I say, right? Okay, so the first thing you're going to need to do is figure out what curve you're going to make. And so on this piece of paper I have sketched out my curve, and then I'm going to come in and actually going to finish off my line here. Paper template. Paper templates are really helpful because you can transfer this onto multiple pieces of MDF, and that way if you're making more pieces you can just keep on going by placing the template on there. And then also sometimes if you screw up or your curve's not that great, at least it's on a piece of paper and not marks all over the MDF. So I've made this paper template. I'm going to cut it out now. Now this is just a basic 1-part jig for a very small piece. If you're going to be making a much thicker, wider curve, you're going to want to probably make a very thin template out of an 1/8 inch thick MDF, and then you'll use a router to transfer that shape onto your form. But since this is just a basic bend, and if you're just starting out and just wanting to learn how to just mess around with bending, then you don't want to get too complicated. Just doing it straight onto the MDF is okay just for practice and just to get used to the process of going through making the bend. You do want to keep in mind that the cleaner your curve line is, the cleaner your bend is going to be. So you want to make sure that if you draw on like a nice clean line of your curve. And then I'm going to just take this on here temporarily. Help me out here while I trace the pattern onto the MDF. Making sure I'm making a really nice thick line because I need to be able to see this line when I take it over to my bandsaw. If you do not have a bandsaw, that's okay. You can actually make this cut with a jigsaw. It's just going to be a lot more cleanup when you get to the sanding part. You're going to want to make sure that you get a nice flat surface along the edge, and that this is all parallel to each other. And that's something that sometimes if the jigsaw is not aligned properly, or it's more likely that the jigsaw blade is going to make a crooked cut than the bandsaw. Now I have transferred my line, hopefully you can see that. And then I also want to come in and make sure I put an X of the parts that I don't want to keep. So for right now, this is the good edge that I actually want to make the bend on. And then you want to determine which edge of this bend is actually the keep part. So in order to do that, you have to think about where you're going to be placing the clamps and gluing, and you want to put in your clamps on the largest part of the convex rather than the concave, because if I was to actually save this part rather than this part and I would have this internal curve, that's a really big curve for me to try and get a clamp to come in, and then the clamp heads start kind of butting against each other. So it would be much more convenient for me to only have to deal with that in this smaller subtle curve with it coming. So I'm going to actually want to get rid of this outer edge and save this part so that when I'm making this curve and this bend, I'm doing it from this top angle rather than me trying to get a clamp up and inside here. So always when you're going to cut something up, make sure you make note of the waist section so you don't accidentally cut the wrong side. And sometimes if you'd like to, or sometimes I will, put a little arrow indicating, okay, that's my cut section, so I know what side of the line I'm cutting. It's not always necessary. Usually for me, these X's are enough to know which side of the line to stay on. Alright, I'm at the bandsaw, and regardless if you are using a bandsaw or if you are using a jigsaw, you definitely want to wear a mask when you are cutting up MDF. It is pretty gnarly stuff, and you don't want to be breathing in those fibers. So at the very least, throw on a cheapy, this is what I have, a cheapy disposable mask. I will be making reusable masks at some point, hopefully soon. For now, I'm going to throw this mask on and we're going to have a go at cutting this MDF. If this is your first template, or this is actually the first piece that you're going to do, you're going to want to get as close as you possibly can to your line to prevent the amount of sanding that you're gonna have to do to clean up the curve. It is important that your very first, either it be your 1/8 inch thick MDF template or your actual one-shot curve, to get it as smooth as you possibly can. And my little disc sander is only going to be able to do the convex curve here, not going to be able to do my concave. All of that concave work is going to have to be done by hand. But since this is actually the 4th version of this curve I have made, I have another piece that I'm going to use a flush trim bit on a router to actually make this nice and clean. If you are not at that stage, as I said, and you're dealing with just the template, that first one's going to be painstaking. You got to go in, you got to hand sand it, you got to make sure you get a nice perfect flat. Which is why some people like to use that 1/8 inch thick little piece of MDF first, because if you have access to a router, using that 1/8 inch piece template first is a lot easier to sand a little skinny piece to get that line perfect, and then you can flush trim with the router with that piece as the template. For the sake of this video, I'm going to show you how to flush trim, but I'm going to do it with another piece of my 3/4 inch thick MDF, so let's go ahead and set that up. Now, flush trim bit is basically just a cutter head with a little bearing here. You ride the bearing against whatever your pattern is, and then the cutter makes the cut flush, exactly what the name means, flush with the pattern that you're cutting from. And what I mean by that is, like, it's going to roll around here, and as it's going, the bearing is going to copy this top part, which is my smooth bit, and then make the rest flush. If you are using a pattern, go ahead and make that 1/8 inch thick piece your actual one, and you'll carry on with what I'm about to do with the flush trim bit. So to get set up, I really like using this double stick tape. Just stick some double stick onto my piece that I'm using as my pattern. In your case, it may be, like I said, that 1/8 inch thick piece. So I'm going to use the double stick to help hold it onto this piece. Placing these clamps on, not for anything other than just to help give a little bit more pressure to the double stick. So a couple seconds on, and then you can remove them, and that should force the double stick tape to get a good, nice grab. And then I can set this up at the edge of my workstation. I'm not going to be able to do this one big hole cut because I need to clamp down some of this piece to the workstation in order to make sure that it doesn't go flying over on me, right? So I'm going to have to take this in a couple passes. I want to get my clamps on in 2 points so that I'm not worried about this thing kind of twisting on me as I'm making the cut. And so at first, the first pass I'm going to take here is going to be just at this end, and I'm going to go as far as I can until I end up butting up the router against my clamps, and we'll have to stop and reposition my clamps here. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my clamps. I want to make sure that the part that I'm actually cutting is not on my work surface, right? The last thing I want to do is be eating into my work surface. Ooh, my beautiful tables that I built, yeah, not having that. I'll get like 3 passes for me because I want to make sure that these are clear out of the way. Make sure whenever you are done with your tools, you always unplug them so you don't accidentally put them on. That would be bad. Okay, now you gotta pry it apart. If you're making a 2-part jig, this is going to be your first half. I'm going to want to be taking away some negative space under the curve. The reason for that is because if you go and you try to clamp at a certain point as you're trying to come in through here, like trying to snag this curve right here, that bottom edge is in the way, right? This is not going to have you need to have a parallel place for clamp to land, otherwise you're not going to get the right pressure. Why this looks all jacked up like this, because I went in and tried to remove some stuff so that when I come in with the pressure, as it changes, there's place for the clamp. Here's where your paper template actually comes in handy again, if you've made it, because now you can take it and you can lay it in here just slightly under your curve, retrace that out, and then take a pass at that cut, and you'll end up with a parallel shape that should be like a snake-like shape or whatever your shape of your curve is that matches it. Not the jacked up version that this is, right? If you are making a 2-part though, you're going to not touch this, you're going to move on to the next step for the 2-part. You don't have to be too finicky, that's why this edge looks as jacked up as it is. because that's not where the curve is getting glued to. You know, the only perfect curve you need to have is this surface, because that's where it's going to make contact with the laminations, and because this end is just for the purposes of making sure that the clamp can be somewhat parallel, it doesn't have to be perfect. So this underside can be messed up and jacked up like mine is. So there you have it. That is the one part. Coming up is the two part. Once you are satisfied with your first half, use some double stick tape to adhere it to a clean piece of MDF. The next step is to find something to trace your pattern line that will be the same thickness of the bend that you're trying to achieve. In this case, I'm using a square nut that I found, but you can make a donut by cutting a round piece of MDF and drilling a hole through it. The important thing is that the diameter of the donut, or the diameter of whatever you're using, is the same diameter and thickness that ultimately your end bend will be. I've used random items in the past for really thick curves. I've used some lids to soft drink bottles, juice bottles, things like that, and really all you need is just something that will allow you to ride up against the side of your original pattern and give you a space between where the pencil lands and where the original curve is. Ultimately, you will end up with a parallel line that is equivalent to the thickness of your bend. After marking out your area for waste, it's over to the bandsaw to cut out the excess part that is no longer needed for the jig. So what you should end up with is a form that is the opposite end of the first half of the curve. And just like the first half, you need to go in with a block sander and sand everything nice and smooth, removing any of the little bits of chatter that it may have picked up from either your bandsaw or your jigsaw, whatever you were using. You really want this to be just as smooth as the first half, because this is going to make full contact with your curve as well as the opposite side, and any little imperfections that are left in the jig will translate into the curve, so you'll end up with a lumpy curve if you don't get rid of all of those wrinkles. Once your second half is completed, sanded down, smoothed, and trimmed up, you are ready to apply your packing tape. Packing tape. So here we go. You're going to tape up your jig. You want to make sure you cleaned it first, and then I'm just going to go in and apply pressure to try and make sure I get it centered. I want this little extra overage. In a minute you're going to see why. Use a pair of scissors to make slices about 1/2 inch apart around the outside edge. Take those little snippets out so that it make it easier for me to make it around these curves. This side's okay because I can flap these down against the edge, but I don't want to necessarily end up pushing this over again on itself. I want to make sure that this stays nice and clean with only one piece of tape on this surface, because that's where the actual bending is going to happen. So for those extra bits, I'm just going to use my scissors to chop off that end. And then you have to do the most important part, which is to burnish this on here. So I'm going to take the back end of these scissors and go in, and you probably can't see this on the camera, but as I'm burnishing, the tape color is changing. Like, you'll see it actually sticking to the jig itself. So you want to make sure you do this. If you forgot to clean it, that may be a problem. You may not get it to stick to the piece. So make sure, like I said, you've taken a damp rag and wiped it on there, and then let it dry a bit before you go and apply the tape. I'm going to do this other side. I want to actually do both glue ups. I'm going to show you the glue up with the one part, and I'm going to show you the glue up with the two part. You can decide which version you want to make, and I will put that in another video. I did not burnish first because I just kind of went with my finger to make sure that it's stuck in place before I go back with the burnishing. Just in case, I feel like it's a little easier to get these little snippets, these snips in here, to relieve some of the, from it getting wrinkled. And if you go in, and there have been times where I've burnished without putting the sides down first, and sometimes it ends up making the top wrinkled, so that's why I'm doing that before I burnish. You'll notice it's not lining up perfectly, and that gap is designed so that when the actual bend goes into its place, you still get adequate pressure for the bend and it sits with the right amount of distance. Alright, there you have it. 2-part versus 1-part jig making. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching this. See you soon.